Good morning. My name is Inga Cotton, and this is Charter Moms Chats. I'm the founder and executive director of San Antonio Charter Moms, and our guest today is Bekah McNeel, also known as Hall Monitor. And she's been writing a series this spring and summer and fall about special education, and we called the series Towards a Kinder World because we want parents to be able to read these posts and maybe identify things in their own children that are, maybe learning differences that are causing issues. We want to make special education less scary for parents and talk about alternatives, like the behavior interventions and stuff. But the last two posts that Bekah wrote for SA Charter Moms on this series, one has to do with vision therapy and one has to do with hearing loss. And we thought that they kind of made a good pair because they're talking about, physical differences, right? Like vision therapy corrects issues with vision. Hearing loss is something that can kind of creep up on a family if they aren't noticing the signs. And it can show up as issues in learning that look kind of like behavior issues or reading issues. And that's why we thought that it's something that we think maybe parents don't know enough about, don't know to look for. So Bekah talked to some families who had experienced this. So I'm gonna like turn myself down, turn Bekah up, and let her talk about
the buzz. I don't know how to speak at any other speed.
That's right.
Yeah. Learning about these things was so interesting to me because you think of if a child is having trouble hearing or seeing, that seems like something you figure out pretty early on when they're babies. And we have a pretty narrow definition of what hearing loss and vision impairment look like. And the reality is that there's just as much diversity in our ears and eyes as there is in our brains, and the diversity in our ears and eyes interacts with the diversity in our brains. And so everybody's hearing and seeing journey looks different. And I think a lot of us are used to that, like middle school age, your hormones shift, every time your hormones shift, it affects your vision. And so we're used to the middle school needing glasses, like the time in middle school you need glasses, or in various stages of childhood, or when you are getting older. Or those of us, I had, when I was pregnant, I had changes in my vision. And so we're used to that. We're used to kind of this thing where it's like, oh, I think I need glasses. I'm getting headaches. But it turns out that there's more than myopathy and I just lost the name of the other one, being farsighted, being nearsighted and farsighted. There's more than that, or more than astigmatism, more than those basic things that our ophthalmologists diagnose. And for a lot of parents, this shows up when the child is reading, because it's about the eyes tracking together. It's about the ability to focus near, focus far. When you think about a classroom environment, you're looking down at your book, you're looking up at your teacher, you're looking down at your math worksheet, you're looking up at the teacher, you're looking up at the blackboard. And if your eyes are a little bit slower at that, it results in just that momentary delay. And I don't think a lot of adults appreciate how fast a classroom is moving for those younger kids. We know how to read, and so following the teacher as she writes on the blackboard is not a problem. But if you don't know if you're learning to read, then you need time. You need every split second you can get. And so your eyes not tracking together, the ability of two eyes to follow along the same reading line. Or if they don't focus at the same rate, you get blurred issues, or things are jumping around. And those, so I just heard from families who were talking about, and a kid doesn't know how to describe that to you. They've never seen the world any other way. So They can't say, oh, things are blurrier than they should be. They might not even understand that think of, again, going back to that experience that many of us have had about getting glasses. The day, your vision's been getting slowly worse and worse and worse. You get your glasses, you look outside, and you're like, leaves on the trees. That's like the classic getting glasses story. Well, if if you didn't start with great vision that then declined,
Right.
it's more like, why are the trees broken up into all those little pieces? And so kids who start out with this have never experienced a world where the words on the page look like we see them.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and
The words have always been wiggling, and
yeah,
they
and
just think
there's
they're supposed to
always
try
been like
harder.
weird blurriness issues. There's always been kind of a smear as they try to go across. And so um, the vision therapy and your regular garden variety ophthalmologist isn't going to be able to identify these things. They have to partner with a vision therapist who knows exactly how to test for those things. And that was where I connected to the vision therapists in the story, who were able to kind of say, okay, here's what we test for, here's how we do it, and then here are the things that we recommend. And it's um, a lot of therapy, a lot of practice, a lot of um, what in your what we call occupational therapy, more than um, just getting a pair of special lenses and then it's all better. And so it's a journey. It's a journey for parents. But I think that for a lot of parents, it sounded like it was a relief that it was the mechanical issue and not a neurological issue. The things that seem to be only in our brain, I think for parents are a little, from what I understand and what I'm hearing, the stuff that's only in your brain, dyslexia, autism, is feels more mysterious and hard to get to. Whereas the stuff that's linked to eyes, ears, motor skills, those things feel more surmountable because we just understand more about our eyes and ears. Those are
Right.
issues that have demanded addressing for a lot longer. And so it's connected to something you can understand, and what we don't realize is that there's just as mysterious of a brain retraining happening. The neurologists are telling me that, and there's even an episode of Hidden Brain, the NPR podcast, where they were talking about you can like vision strategies you can do to help you think differently.
Ooh.
So there is this really important connection between our eyes and our brains. But when we have the eyes as a something to focus on, I think it makes that brain. We don't realize the complexity of what's going on in the brain, and
Yeah.
but at the same time, it makes it seem more approachable. So that, and then hearing loss was something. I talked to two women who I've known actually for a really long time, but hadn't caught up with in a long time. Because I remember when I was working as a children's minister, hearing one of the moms at our church say that she thought her son had been like being rebellious. Like she thought that he had been not listening or had been ignoring her and her husband. And it turned out that he had like profound hearing loss in one of his ears. And
Wow.
so they were on the wrong side of him or whatever. Um, he actually, I think his might be in both ears. Anyway, he'd had profound hearing loss that was affecting his ability to hear them and respond to them. And so for her, and I think most parents would probably experience that as a behavioral thing. But it could also look like struggling in school if there
Right.
are,
Right.
if because a lot of times it has to do with frequency and pitch. And so if
Right.
there's a teacher who has the wrong voice, like if it's a male teacher and they can't hear low tones, or it's a female
Right.
teacher with an exceptionally high voice and they can't hear those tones, the kid's going to struggle. And it's going to be, especially if they don't struggle with their parents' voice, um, it's going to be
Right.
very confusing because it'll you haven't picked up on it. And we do hearing screening for babies now, which
Right.
goes a long way. But then what we found, what another possibility from another mom is that something can happen to your ear
Right.
In her case, in her daughter's case, it was a virus. But there's a lot of things that can happen too, because our ears, it's, hearing is caused when bones vibrate and it sends these pitches and your brain interprets them. Well, a lot of things can go wrong. That's a mechanical
Mhm.
neurological interface that with a lot of stuff going on. And so a lot of stuff could go wrong. And when that goes wrong, it depends on when in your developmental process that happens as to how well you can compensate how many
Right.
compounding issues. And so if it happens while speech is developing as in a baby, there's going to be there's a lot of ramifications from that. There's a lot of consequences because the baby um, needs their hearing to develop their speaking. And there are sounds that are very subtle and there are sounds that are more obvious. And so when you start to lose parts of hearing and depth perception, can, or not, like your balance is affected
Right.
by that.
Right. Right.
When Sarah Bow's daughter came down with the virus, the worst way they noticed is that she got horrible vertigo. And
Ah,
so her inner ear
yeah.
was
Yeah.
inflamed, and so she had terrible vertigo. And so had she been learning to walk or whatever, that would have been there would have been huge consequences for that. As she was in third
Yeah.
grade, so her language was developed. Her brain could adjust and get her sense of balance back, but it took a week. And that's a scary week
Wow.
when you're waiting to hear what's going on in your kid's brain. And
Yeah.
so access to really good diagnostic healthcare obviously becomes critical in these. I mean, this is not your standard pediatrician, standard
Right.
ophthalmologist. These are not um, the things that your insurance expects to see from you. And so it really does it raises a lot of issues around healthcare because
Yeah.
every parent included multiple trips to a specialist. You have to be able to qualify for all sorts of things to get the right hearing aids. We set a really
Right.
high bar for how much hearing loss or vision loss you have to have before insurance will consider you in need.
Right.
And
Because like one of the stories, it was one year but not the other, right? And that
yes, yes,
affected.
that was Jeremiah.
Yeah.
And so they just had to pay for and hearing aids are really expensive. They're in the thousands of dollars. And that for most families is a significant setback. And so there are like there's nonprofits and whatnot who will help. And Sheila was eventually able to connect with one. I think Any Baby Can was what helped her. And that I think is probably one of the biggest areas for change, like our toward a kinder world would be that
Yeah.
recognizing that even subtle issues in your basic information taking senses,
Yeah.
hearing and
Yeah.
sight, that's how you learn.
Mhm.
People say I learn by doing. Well, that's hand-eye coordination. It's talking things out. External processing has as much to do with hearing as it does with saying. Um, and so that is learning, is hearing and seeing.
Yeah.
And any time those are compromised, you run the risk of compromising all sorts of other development. And so
Right.
that I think that when we're talking about toward a kinder world, is setting, instead of thinking this is how deficient a sense, a physical sense has to be in order to be considered a disability, we need to rethink that and go to this is what fully functioning looks like, and we need to do whatever we can to make sure that every child who um, who wants to be there can be there. And I mean,
Mhm.
I want to say that with full respect to, especially to the deaf community, who definitely feels like cochlear implants and hearing aids and whatnot are not always the answer for them. Um,
Right.
but if a family and a person with hearing loss decides to opt for sign language or non-invasive, non-corrective apparatus, that person still needs to be given access to a primary mode of learning that is high quality. So if it's ASL interpretation, really a classroom that's designed to facilitate lip reading,
Yeah.
that kind of thing, even if it's just amplification in the classroom, for those who don't have profound hearing loss, I think that we need to be prepared to offer that, because that's the other thing, is that a cochlear implant is a big deal. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a device implanted inside your head. And for people who opt not to do that, I don't I don't know that we want to live in a culture that mandates invasive surgery in order to receive your free and appropriate public education. And
True.
so I think that a kinder world is looking at what's the primary way that this student is able to, how do we maximize the senses that they have? How do we give them the appropriate therapies and accommodations in the classroom? Where do we apply technology versus where do we apply positioning in the classroom, and patience and multiple ways of presenting things, accommodations?
Yeah.
How do we combine those two things so that every student and family feels that they are getting what they need to succeed, whether that's through their insurance, through their public school, or some other method. But the health insurance and public schools are most likely the most far-reaching ways that those things can be made available.
Right. That the goal should be that every child has the health they need to be able to learn, and
Yeah,
that their senses are working as at the highest level that we can get them, with all the sort of medical and therapeutic support that they need. I think that that sort of health and medical aspect gets left out in discussions about equity and what challenges students do or don't bring to the classroom, that right, but that having all the students be in good health makes a huge difference for learning, and we it's easy to kind of take it for granted and just be like, well, that's a separate issue, but it's not a separate issue. The
no,
students have to be in good health to be able to learn, and they have to, and for some kids it's a quick fix, and for some kids it takes, like my son had a year of vision therapy to correct a lazy eye, and the fact that his eyes weren't working as a team, and like you said, it was a lot of it was just a lot of physical practice of like strengthening the muscles and getting the eyes to work together in a better way.
absolutely. It's I think that breakdown between health, well, first of all, American, I don't know, maybe this is global. I definitely, in our country, we don't understand health as a process very well. We're much bigger on like fix it now. Um,
Right.
and the the fact that you will have health as a process while learning is also a process, and those two processes need to be happening together,
Mhm.
for a lot of, for many kids at some point or another. um,
Yeah.
Honestly, it's a little bit of a stretch, but it's not unrelated to what we're doing right now, um, with going back to school amid a pandemic. Is this There is an impatience I'm seeing. I'm seeing it myself. I'm seeing it in, mostly in middle class families, but an impatience with this taking so long.
Right.
Um, and there is just this kind of um, weird. I don't think anybody's consciously thinking this, but there is a underlying illogical belief that the pandemic should realize that we're starting school. Like that. I mean, I heard a parent at a board meeting say, where there's a will, there's a way to open schools. And I'm like, we're not used to being able to not just will this away. We're not used
Yeah.
to being able to not say, hold on, we can, but rather than saying, okay, we can figure out a way to live through this. We can figure out some way to, it is where there's a will, where I can bend this to my will. And that,
Right.
I think parents who have children with disabilities or neurological differences understand probably better than the rest of us that that's just not the case.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there are things in this world that aren't ideal and will affect your child's education, and yet, you'll live with them.
Yeah. It's
And
it's broken. It's broken, but you can love the brokenness, right? And you can find a way to have joy and embrace it, right? And take care of the brokenness as best we can, right? And we can still love our children, and no child is perfect. So, but I think that the families with children with differences, feel that more acutely, and sometimes we shake our fists at the world and be like, why is this different? But
yeah,
but yeah, right. No, I see the analogy too with the situation that we're in. Like there's no technocratic solution. There's no quick fix
we
for
can't
this.
skip our way out of
Yeah.
it. We can't.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's just the more I do this series, the more I report, the more I suspect that this idea that we have of neurotypicalness is probably not as homogenous and uniform as we think. I think that what's homogenous and uniform is the way we have structured the world. And then there's just an endless array of brains functioning in it
Yeah.
and working with it. And I think that a lot of our conversation around mental health, a lot of our conversations around innovation really could be helped by understanding the infinite variety of brain function. I don't mean that in like high low brain function, but diverse brain function, neurodiversity. When we are talking about problem solving, when we are talking about health, that it's we've kind of flipped it and made it like we all have these brains, and so this is how your brain works, and so this is the best way to do things and stuff. And what we end up doing is creating, maybe a broad range of people can interact with a certain thing. But I mean, I'm not questioning brain science. Obviously, we understand a lot about how the brain works, but within that, all of our brains have been exposed to a different collection, different balances of chemicals, a different collection of influences. Understanding now how reading reshapes the brain,
Mhm.
that to me, I'm like, so the age at which you learn to read, how much you read, and that doesn't mean that it's making your brain better. It means it's making your brain different. And we don't know all of the consequences of that. And so I think that the more I report, the more I just go, oh, wow, we are like, there could be two kids who are in a gen ed classroom who are considered neurotypical, who are more different from each other than either of those kids is from another child in special education.
Right. 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 I can definitely see that. Also, this makes me. I'm thinking about like you have written and have more in the pipeline about posts about reading in this series. And I think that I guess you tell me if you see it this way too. But I think one thing I've taken away from um, right, that we need to look at how to teach reading in a different way, and not just to say like, well, this sounds nice, let's use this theory,
Mhm.
but actually like look at like what works for the most kids, right? Understanding that there's lots and lots of different brains out there, but let's have ways of teaching reading that work for as many different kinds of brains as possible, and be alert for when something's not working, and we get those kids the support that they need.
Yes. And I'm glad you said that, because it's about finding a way of teaching reading that relies on the scientific processes and allows different brains with different makeups to take those tools and use them most effectively, rather than a method that doesn't rely on that, and only kids who have certain tools in their brains already will be able
Right.
to access it. So it's about giving tools rather than requiring tools. Um, and that's what's coming up next month in these. And now the reading wars are still controversial. I mean, it's like been the hidden, the secret war. It's not so secret; it blows up every now and then. But I don't think that that most of us are as aware of how controversial learning to read is in the learning
Right.
community. And so, um, my next two pieces for you are very dry. They're very technical because while a lot of, I mean, every parent wants their child to see as well as they can. Everybody, I mean, when there's a set collection of therapies that work, most of us are very comfortable with the idea of glasses. But reading does not have that public comfort level with it. It is it turns out our brain reading is not a natural thing. You can't just sit among words and suddenly one day they start making sense. Someone has to teach you. And there's a way that can be taught that is accessible to the most brains so that they can go and develop the structures that will make them fluent. And the correct hemisphere will grow, as long as we have decided that reading is how society is going to communicate with each other. You're going to need your brain to develop this kind of lopsided structure that is a reading brain. And I had the opportunity to talk to some really amazing researchers who there is scientific consensus around to some level that I have been reading and hearing. There's a scientifically based way to learn to read. It is not as fun or feel goody or like joy of learning as other models, but I think most parents can attest that the ultimate joy of learning is your kid being able to read, not your kid struggling to read. So
Right.
the more
Right.
kids,
Them having confidence and feeling proud about I can read. Yeah.
yes. And I've watched, so Moira, just to personalize this, Moira started to learn to read in preschool. Like she reached what in Montessori they called the sensitive period, where she was curious about it and wanting to read and pretending to write and that kind of thing. And we did not push it too hard. We got it happened right at the end of the school year, not this last year, but the year before. And so over the summer, we did hire someone to give her like 3 or 4 phonics lessons, just so that she could spend the summer with some basic tools she did, but she kind of just read a word here and there, and we didn't push it any harder than that. We also didn't know what her reading instruction would look like in school, and I know that it's not mandated that they teach in this evidence-based way. And so I, not knowing what she was getting, that's why we decided to get her just 4 little instructional 30-minute chunks. And but turns out when they're teaching the kids to read in Spanish, a lot of it is Spanish is very conducive to this method. There's a lot of breaking down of syllables. There's a lot of, they practice these groups of words that make consistent sounds. And over this summer, it has all followed its trajectory. Now we're in this kind of explosive stage, and watching her explode. I mean, it felt like it took forever. It was like a year and a half of us, because we just decided not to push it, but a year and a half of her gathering her tools and being able to put together more and more other things. She started reading way better in Spanish because it's just a more logical construction. But then over the summer, and you know what's so funny is that it was her Pokemon field guide that did it for her. It has the pronunciation guides, and they have these
Oh.
absurd names, but she breaks them down and I'm like, I mean, she's reading things that are difficult for Lewis and I to read because you're looking at this Pokemon word and I'm going, this looks like nothing I've ever seen before. I don't know what it is, but she can do it. And so, um, while I definitely, I would not have described her journey thus far to as being this like necessarily joyful thing. It seemed kind of like, um, mundane and tedious. Now it's so joyful. And she's a great reader at age 6. And I have very high hopes for, how much I'm thinking of all the books she's going to get to read. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like her teachers put in the work. She put in the work. We were patient and didn't like stress anybody out, I don't think.
Yeah.
And it has
Yeah.
paid off in like spades.
That is I love that. Yeah. I think like so many good choices there, right? That I think like being tuned into her, and noticing that she's curious, right? And then that's a sign that she's entering this stage. And then also like I think having trust in the kindergarten teachers and right, but also observing, right? And
Mhm.
noticing that the way they were teaching Spanish,
Yeah.
was based on science and reading. Because like Spanish is a language that actually makes sense, unlike English, right?
I was just going, and it's so nice when she can't understand an English word. I'm like, sound it out in Spanish first. And let's see if this sounds even remotely close to an English word. and but she'll say, if I say, oh, that's a Spanish word, she'll flip her little she code switches.
Yeah.
Or it's not really what that word's used for. But she switches into Spanish decode. She decodes
Right.
switches. And it's cool. It's cool to see. It I think as an adult, you look at somebody learning to read and it like stresses out your brain because you're like, oh my gosh, it's so fundamental and it's every single thing is effort when you're learning to read. And in that, I forgot like just the amazing capacity of a tiny, uncluttered human brain. she's,
Yeah.
she's not trying to remember anything else. She's just
Right.
memorizing Pokemon and reading in Spanish and English. Um,
Right, right, right. And I think what I think an important takeaway for your story from Moira's experience is like put in the work to build that foundation with the phonics, and then
mhm.
watch the decoding happen, and then watch like the discovery and like be able
Yeah.
to unlock this world of books out there.
Yes.
So
It
yeah,
is. It's kind of. It reminds me of an author was talking about the connection between discipline and freedom. And they were saying, like, when you watch an ice skater out on a rink, they look so free. Like, they can do things on ice that I can't do. And they're
yeah.
free to jump, to do all this stuff that I'm not free to do. I'm bound by my clutchiness.
I would fall in my butt. Yeah,
Yeah. I'm bound by gravity. And the only reason they're free to do that is because they developed the skills. And this developing the skills was not any more like they were obviously driven and whatnot and compelled by some desire and some enjoyment, but it was not necessarily any different for them than it would be for me had I, at a young age, whatever. But that process of learning follows steps. It follows, first you have to learn to do this, got to walk before you can run type stuff.
hmm
And so neurologically following processes is really reliable. When you talk to adults, this was another fascinating thing as I was writing about reading. I was talking to adults who had I learned, shout out to Howard Early Childhood Center where I went to kindergarten. My teacher back in 1989 um, used evidence-based reading. We did phonics, we did syllables, and then I had other teachers throughout my education all the way through 8th grade, who would drill us in, we call them phonograms, like groups of words that say stuff, or groups of letters that say a variety of things, and we had to memorize, all of that, and it was tedious and whatnot. But I loved, and then have always had this love of reading. I've always read, can decipher most things, etc. And I was talking to people who, my age and older, who grew up in whole language instruction, and they still, to this day, if they come across a word that they don't know, they're not familiar with, have a much, much harder time, and it slows down their reading. And I'm talking about, like, I was talking to educators and just friends who say, like, oh yeah, my reading for me is not it's not like riding a bike. You can't do it without thinking. Yeah. I remember as a kid getting to the point where I could read without thinking.
Yeah.
And the words would just kind of like come in. And I just remember being like, this is amazing. It's almost like I'm watching TV, because it's in. And that's, I think it's like riding a bike. And obviously 1,000 different, there's many ways where those two activities are not the same.
But to think about people who struggled with it, kids who struggle with it, and adults who still struggle with it, and that's heartbreaking.
Yeah. And even if that struggle no longer defines them as adults, I think it's still a like frustration. But a couple of people I talked to are like, I don't really know it any other way. I don't really understand the difference between what I'm doing and actual fluency. But there is a difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, I'm really excited about the posts about reading that are coming out next month. I feel like I could talk to you about this for a long, long time, but my kids have their back to school haircuts today. So that's one of our few, like, so we mask up and go get haircuts. So that's what we're going to go do next.
One for my kids, because it's getting wild and woolly.
Yeah, everything about back to school is different this year, but yeah, we will celebrate this milestone. So yeah, Bekah, it's always good to talk to you, and I'm really excited to share the reading post. And I hope folks will please look at the description, the links, and read up about vision therapy and hearing loss and how those impact learning. So do you have any like closing thoughts?
No, everybody treat each other with grace and compassion as you're going back to school. Nobody's making easy choices. This month is just, it's pick, as when Mom put it to me, pick your poison. It's this is the next month, I hope can be defined by us all just being incredibly gracious with each other.
Yeah. That's a great message. Yes. We all need to be gracious with each other because we're all making tough choices. Yeah. Well said. Well said. Okay. Well, thank you, Bekah. And I'll see you soon. Okay, bye.